Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Seth.
And I'm Zach.
And we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
And welcome to a spooky Halloween episode, because this is episode, I don't know what episode it is, but it's coming out on the 30th, and tomorrow is Halloween. So if you're cuddling, I was going to say cuddling in bed listening to us.
You know, it's a romantic evening. If you and your loved one, you cuddle up in bed and
put
on those Classic Gaming Brothers.
Put on those Classic Gaming Brothers. To be honest, I think the only people that listen to us in bed are the people who need us to fall asleep. Which I'm sure there are people that are like, what's the most boring podcast around? It's Classic Gaming Brothers. Zach's falling asleep in the studio.
I'm falling asleep right now. Well, today is not a sleepy episode. Today is a scary episode.
Yeah. Oh, I think almost the entire episode is themed spooky ways. In fact, every game that we're going to talk about in every section of today's podcast
is a horror game.
Is a little spooky. Yeah, it's
cool.
Or
is like horror themed, or
has horror elements, or is vaguely horror related.
Yeah.
or
there's monsters involved.
Or, there's 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, right. Well, Seth, on the topic of spooky games, what spooky games have you been spooky playing?
Ooh. So I've been recently playing If on Winter's Night for Travelers, which is a story-driven point-and-click adventure game, because what else is new? And it does have a little bit of horror elements attached to it. It covers a story of 4 characters and takes place in the 1920s. It was developed and published by Dead Idle Games. So I played a little bit of the early part of the game. I haven't got through the entirety of the game. It is pixel art, and you start off, you're on a train, and a guy that kind of looks like Anubis talks to a guy that kind of looks like a skeleton, and they're talking about why they're on the train. And I assume the train is going somewhere where dead people go. And the 4 characters who you then go into their stories think they're all dead. But that's just my assumption from literally just the intro of the game. But I'll find out as I play through the game. Though I would say that I'm actually pretty good at predicting tropes, I guess. Probably from watching a lot of sitcoms in my life. I'm very good at predicting how things kind of will end, but my wife gets mad at me because I'll end up being like, and then this thing's gonna happen. She's like, how did you know that that person was gonna get like arrested or shot or whatever? And I was like, just a trope. But anyway, I've been playing If on Winter's Night for Travelers. Been really digging the story. I also really like the pixel art. I think I mentioned that already, but I really started to like the pixel art even more so with the way that they presented the adventure element of it. You start off with this character who's in Rome, who's in a hotel, and you're in a bedroom, and it's an isometric view, and you can move your character around through this isometric view, and there's like shadowy areas off to the other side, and as you go through those shadowy areas, it just transitions into like the next room, and the other room goes dark, and it kind of concentrates on the room that you're in, and the lighting is just something that I really noticed, and I thought they really did a great job with the shadowing and the lighting of the game, and brought forward kind of almost as much realism as you can with pixel art, but did a solid job. I really enjoyed the artwork, and is something that really kind of got me even more like beyond the interesting story. Got me like, I was like, oh, I actually think I'm gonna continue playing this game. And another interesting fact about If on Winter's Night for Travelers is that it's free.
Ooh.
So you could just go on Steam and download the full game for free. So if you like adventure games and you want a new adventure game and you don't want to spend any money, go download this game. It's free. So Zach, what have you been playing?
Well, Seth, to get myself into the spooky mood, I've been revisiting a game that we've previously talked about and actually streamed a long time ago, and that game is Phasmophobia, which is a game that was released in 2020 by Kinetic Games, and it's a game where you hunt ghosts.
They've updated it since.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why I was playing, was because they've done some pretty major updates in terms of not just graphics, but also some of the gameplay mechanics have been slightly tweaked, and they've made some improvements. One of the things they updated, which I think was nice, is in the older versions of the game, the difficulty levels were assigned to the actual places you go. So the smaller houses were often like easy, and then when you get to the bigger places, it's intermediate, and then you get to the even bigger places, it's like hardcore. Now you can actually manually adjust the difficulty level for any level. So you could go to like the school, which was considered the hardest level, and set it to easy if you just want to go to the school and get spooked by a ghost. It's still a large level, so you probably should go there with multiple people, but they've made some adjustments and stuff like that. Another thing they did was they totally redesigned the starting room that you are in. The
the little house. Or the
house,
hub,
yeah.
I guess, the hub space.
It's now like 2 floors with a little loft that you can go to that has some physics games you can play with. Like there's a cornhole set. You can throw the cornhole bean bags, and there's a Jenga set, and you can pull the Jenga pieces off. And so I think they just wanted to kind of like show you how much the physics have improved in the past few updates. But it's a fun game. It can be pretty spooky. The game does use your microphone, so it's able to sometimes pick up on things that you say. So like, for example, if you know the name of the ghost, not necessarily the type of ghost, but the name of the ghost, like if its name is Jeffrey, and you say Jeffrey, you might trigger the ghost to attack you or like target you. The point of the game, though, for those who don't know, is you're trying to identify the type of ghost. You might know his name, but you don't know if he's like a djinn or a banshee or a wraith or a poltergeist. So there's all the different types, and they've added a few new ones. I forget what they're called, like the actual types of ghosts, but they added a few new ones. I know one they added is called the Twins, which is a pair of ghosts that will haunt you. They've done some pretty cool things with the game since we last played it a few years ago. They've added a few new maps. There's now a campsite that you can go to, and I think they've updated a bunch of the houses and stuff. But it's been pretty fun to play. When I was playing it with some of my friends, we found a Ouija board, and we started using it, and then the Ouija board exploded, and I died. And it was not very fun. But my friends were like, uh-oh, Zach's dead now. But it's okay. If you die in the game, people can take a photo of your body, and you get all your money back because you get an insurance claim.
Insurance. That's right.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if you died in the game, you don't die in real life.
I hope not. Otherwise, I'm a ghost. Ooh.
Maybe you are.
Well, for today's spooky episode, we're going to be talking about a spooky series. And that series, specifically the first game of it, is Splatterhouse.
That's a fun game. I'm a big fan of Splatterhouse.
Yeah, why don't you tell us about your memories, Seth?
I don't really have any memories of Splatterhouse.
Oh.
So I learned about Splatterhouse recently-ish through my obsessive watching of SNES Drunk on YouTube, because his videos are great because they're short and they explain things about games that I generally have not played a lot of, because he talks a lot about SNES games, and I played a lot of Sega Genesis games. So the games that he covers are generally games that I haven't played unless they had a Sega Genesis port. But he does have a Sega Drunk subgroup where he does Sega games, which Splatterhouse was primarily on the Sega Genesis. But we didn't own it because there was violence, and we wouldn't own a game called Splatterhouse. Our parents would never let us buy a game called Splatterhouse. So I didn't have childhood memories of playing Splatterhouse, but I did recently play a bit because I thought the graphics were kind of cool based on the YouTube videos that I watched. It's got a really cool motif.
It's kind of a 80s slasher aesthetic to it.
And it's a beat 'em up, so like you always love beat 'em ups. So like you make a 80s slasher as a beat 'em up, I'm gonna play that game.
I was also introduced to Splatterhouse through a YouTuber, though the video I watched of Splatterhouse had to have been in like 2008 or 2009 or so, because I used to watch a YouTuber. I still watch him. I watched him specifically back in around the like 2007, 2008, 2009 period, when he went by the name of the Happy Video Game Nerd. And it was a YouTuber named Derek Alexander. And the Happy Video Game Nerd started out as a parody of the Angry Video Game Nerd, and it became its own like series. And specifically, he talked about obscure video games that make him happy, and did a satire of like the angry nerd motif. But one of the games that he covered was Splatterhouse. And he talked about the OG Splatterhouse, and then later did a video on the remake Splatterhouse game. And currently, Derek Alexander is known as Stop Skeletons from Fighting, which is a YouTube channel that he hosts with his partner Grace, and they go over obscure video games. To get into the history of Splatterhouse. Splatterhouse was first released in 1988 by Namco. And I went back a little bit in our notes, and I don't think we talked about Namco before. Or if we have, we've alluded to them. I don't think we've gone into like the history of Namco. For those who might not know, or if we did allude to Namco, I just forgot about it, might not remember, the company got its actual start back in 1955, and it was founded by Masaya Nakamura, who was the son of a shotgun repair business owner. And Nakamura wanted to work on shipbuilding. But in the 1950s, Japan was going through what was called a post-war economy. And that meant shipbuilding was not a venue that you could easily get into. And he opted to go for a different line of work, which was developing amusement machines, which he got the idea from because his father had converted the shotgun repair business into a pop cork gun business where they created pop cork gun toys. Namco's early titles in these days were primarily electromechanical games like Torpedo Launcher and Periscope, and they also created gun games, with some being based on the Ultraman franchise. By the 1970s, Atari had begun releasing arcade titles in the US and Japan, and Atari Japan's president, Tanichi Takumi, approached Namco and suggested that they distribute Atari games in Japan. So Namco signed a deal with Atari Japan, which turned out to be a risky decision.
And with some risk comes reward, but not with this. This risky decision became a very bad kind of decision. Atari of Japan was a financial mess, with reports of staff stealing from the company and nearly collapsing in the first year of operation. Things got so bad that Atari Japan's president Takuma stopped showing up to work. That's how bad it was. And the Japanese culture is very pro work and having a really strong work ethic. So if you're the president and you just stop showing up, that's bad. Nolan Bushnell, Atari of America's co-founder, sold the Japanese division to Namco after finding no one else to buy it. Namco acquired Atari Japan for $550,000 and as an initial payment and 3 yearly payments of $250,000, which is a pretty good deal for a company. I mean, the company wasn't in good shape, but they could turn it around. The purchase, again, was not the best move for Namco, as the Japanese arcade market was going through a fad of medal games where people could win tokens in exchange for cash. This may sound like gambling because it is, but the medium of the exchange for money was done with tokens instead of actual cash. And it was not done in a gambling hall, it was done in an arcade. And those distinctions made it so that it was legal to do in Japan. Interestingly enough, our gambling halls also use tokens.
Yeah, it's pretty much how we do it, so.
Except actually with slot machines, generally take straight money. However, gambling laws started to get stricter in Japan, probably because there was a bunch of people that were skirting them. And with them being stricter, that meant that less people were playing gambling games, and instead, people still needed the distraction, so they were playing video games, like Breakout, which was brought over to Japan by Namco with massive success. So by the late 1970s, Namco was actually considered one of the leading video game companies in Japan. In 1979, they released Galaxian, which was a smash hit, selling 40,000 arcade units in the US by 1981 and 50,000 by 1982. Galaxian was quickly toppled from its throne by another Namco game, Puckman, which would be later renamed Pac-Man, which we've talked about before in our Iconic Heroes episodes.
Yeah, we covered the fact that the whole Pac-Man, why he was called Pac-Man versus Puckman.
Right.
Has to do with the F word.
Because you don't want him to be the other way.
Man. Anyway, Pac-Man would end up being one of the biggest successes for Namco, and it generated more than $14 billion in revenue by 2016 and 43 million units in combined sales. Namco continued releasing games, and a team led by Hiroshi Yokoyama began working on a game that would change things up in terms of how people see video games. Yokoyama's team, while not being officially credited at the time, gave the world what would become Splatterhouse. And what I mean by change how we see video games, I mean Splatterhouse is one of those games that generated a ton of controversy on its release. It was kind of up there with the games that later Mortal Kombat, but prior to that Death Race, which is when politicians had to make a list of games that were corrupting our youth. Splatterhouse would be right there with them. Games that Joe Lieberman hates. Splatterhouse combines the beat-em-up genre that many may be familiar with from titles like Double Dragon with the gore and violence of a 1980s slasher flick. So instead of punching criminals, you are smashing monsters with 2x4s, blades, and a double-barrel shotgun.
And weapons are always fun in these early beat-em-up games because they were usually pretty unique as an addition to them. Generally, the beat-em-up games that that came out in the very late 80s, early 90s, were a lot of fists and punching, not a lot of picking up and hitting things. So Splatterhouse was relatively unique with the addition of the weapons that you could pick up. Now, the game draws influence from a variety of horror movies and horror content. The main character, Rick, looks a lot like a mixture between Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, wearing what looks like a hockey mask and also wearing a boiler suit. There's also inspiration from movies like Evil Dead 2 and the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. The game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, so you're only able to move in two directions, left and right. Though later, Splatterhouses will allow a up and down movement.
Yeah, I think the Splatterhouse 3 for the Genesis allows it.
But what you lack in control, you gain in attacks. From punches and jumping attacks to the vast variety of weapons available as we discussed. With each smash of your weapon, the monsters will be splattered across the screen or wall in various states of goriness, which that's why you bought the game, because it's gore. And really, that's a big selling point. Back then, I think even today, sometimes people still buy games because they're violent. And the game's violence was used as a selling point, with the TurboGrafx 16 port containing the advisory warning on it. Horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards. Because this was before ESRB, so they could put whatever they wanted. The arcade version, the cabinet of the game, also contained an advisory. It was one of the first arcade cabinets to actually contain an advisory.
And that was a big deal back then. I mean, for many people, they would walk into an arcade and you would see a cabinet, and the only way you would know what was going on in that game was through the artwork, which was often misleading, or through the attract mode. And the attract mode, yeah, would show you what was going on, but I don't know, you're not going to get probably the full picture of what the game's like. So it was games like Splatterhouse and later Mortal Kombat that really did, I think, draw people in just because of the sheer violence of them.
I feel like one of the reasons why violence is important in video games is because it adds to the gameplay of it. So there is a definite satisfaction that comes through with having a beat 'em up game that gives weight to your character's punches and like gives it so that it actually feels like you're connecting with somebody. And certain beat 'em up games do better, like sales wise, because they have a better and more like heavy combat system. And I think people understand what I'm talking about when I'm saying like if you don't have like a true like if it doesn't feel like you're connecting with somebody or the sound isn't right, it's not going to be as fun as like Streets of Rage or something like that where the sound is good. And Splatterhouse had that, right? Splatterhouse had really good sound, had really good atmosphere, and that violence really played up the gameplay because ultimately the story, as Zach's going to get into in a moment, isn't truly like anything earth-shattering. So you're not playing these games for the story. And really arcade cabinet producers really didn't want to create a story, right? If you created something like with a story that wasn't just gimmicking people into the game, you were maybe wasting time. Like, I guess like what those Dragon's Lair, which had a story, but like I'm trying to think of any other arcade games that had like a significant story that weren't just like concentrating on the gameplay.
Well, the plot of Splatterhouse follows Rick Taylor and Jennifer Willis, who are a couple and also two parapsychology students, parapsychology being the study of the paranormal. And they decide to take shelter on a rainy night in a haunted mansion called the Splatterhouse. And this haunted mansion is called this because of experiments that were conducted by one Dr. West, a scientist who has quite the reputation and currently is missing. They enter the mansion and Rick is quickly knocked out and suddenly awakens in a dungeon. But he doesn't just like wake up in the dungeon. He is resurrected in the dungeon because he died, and he's brought back to life through the use of the Hell Mask, which is an ancient artifact that belongs to Dr. West, and he kept it in his dungeon for some reason. The mask is sentient and attaches itself and fuses to Rick. And he gains superhuman strength and, with the mask's approval, begins to go on a rampage, killing anything that's in his path. And Rick does eventually find Jennifer, but as a spoiler, this is a pretty big spoiler, Jennifer has mutated into a fanged monster, and she attacks you and tries to kill you, and you have to kill her. So you kill Jennifer, she turns back to normal, and she thanks you for putting her out of her suffering. And then Rick gets really mad and he just goes and kills every other monster that's there. Finally, he has to destroy the final monster, which is called the Hell Chaos. In the end, Rick is turned back to normal, the mask is destroyed, and he flees the house, which is currently on fire. However, there's kind of like it's not a post-credit scene because there's no credits in an arcade game, but there is kind of like a pre-end scene, almost like a Marvel stinger, and that is the mask, after being destroyed, reforms itself, lets out an evil laugh, and flies away.
And the story continues in Splatterhouse 2 and 3 and all that jazz.
Yeah, the mask finds Rick again. It refuses to him.
Splatterhouse, the original, did pretty well when it released. In Japan, it quickly made its way to being one of the most popular arcade games with the magazine Game Machine, which is a reputable Japanese magazine that we generally use for referencing things because they were around and doing it. They ranked it at number 6 in 1988. It also equally scored positive reviews on release in Europe and North America, though it was criticized for a lack of variety in terms of actual gameplay, because you walk to the right and you punch things. And the game really does, I think even the bosses, you're really beating them the same way that you beat all the mobs, I guess, throughout the game. So that is a criticism that's valid. The PC Engine TurboGrafx 16 port of the game were highly praised for its accurate recreating of the game, and were also criticized for being toned down in terms of violence. I believe in the TurboGrafx port, there was green goo instead of blood. And then the Sega Genesis did include the blood when the Sega version had it. Splatterhouse received multiple ports with some various changes. The TurboGrafx 16 version became one of the more popular releases when it came out in North America, though the version of the game had some changes, such as Rick's mask being turned red, probably because it was released in America, and they wanted to make it avoid it look like Jason's masks, because they didn't want to get sued. It's funny because when they released the game in Japan, they don't particularly care, because the American lawyers can't get you in Japan, but they can get you in America. Also, various religious imagery was changed, and they took it out. That's the thing that happens a lot when it comes to Japanese ports into the American market, because the Japanese aren't very Christian over there.
It's not necessarily that. I think it's just a different culture. Christianity is in Japan. It's just like there's no taboo to like show religious imagery and stuff.
Where, especially back in the 90s, bringing stuff over with a lot of religious imagery, especially with violence, was not a thing that flew in America. It could probably fly now. I feel like we're a little bit more tolerant of like shocking video games. But not only did they do this for Splatterhouse, they did this for various other... Nintendo did this a lot. They censored a lot
there's entire games that never came out in America because of religious imagery.
But I don't think all the censoring that ever really happened on video games was in the American market was done as self-censoring. The government never demanded a game to be censored. Going back to the TurboGrafx 16 version from that extremely long tangent, the port also toned down the violence and gore a bit, and the enemies bled less and sound effects were less visceral. As we talked about, when sequels came out, they amped it back up. The game would also go on to get released for Windows, the FM Towns Marty, the iOS, and the BlackBerry.
I'm sure everyone loved playing Splatterhouse on the BlackBerry. Now, in 1989, the year after the arcade game, Namco released a parody of the arcade game called Splatterhouse Wampaku Graffiti for the Famicom.
Oh, I'm familiar with that game.
I think you might be. This takes much of the elements of the arcade game and makes them a bit more chibi style, chibi being like cutesy, and also satirizes the story of Splatterhouse. And Seth will talk a bit about more of that in his Retro Rewind. Now, a sequel to Splatterhouse called Splatterhouse 2 was released on the Sega Genesis in 1992 that came out, and a sequel following this came out, Splatterhouse 3, in 1993. And Splatterhouse 3 was actually one of the first games to be given an MA13 rating by the Video Game Rating Council, which was a predecessor to the ESRB. The Video Game Rating Council was like a Sega-specific predecessor to the ESRB. Finally, a reimagining and reboot of the series was released in 2010 for the Xbox 360 and PS3, just under the name Splatterhouse. And I think this version also comes with the original 3 games as ports that you can play. Splatterhouse Reimagining had mixed reviews, with some being very impressed by it and by the soundtrack, the graphics, and the voice acting. Others being less impressed by the difficulty or the glitches or the repetitive gameplay. And I've seen some videos of Splatterhouse 2010. I haven't played it myself. And I heard that from a Splatterhouse fan perspective, it's a pretty fun game. But as someone who's trying to get into the Splatterhouse series and has no experience with Splatterhouse, they probably don't want to play that as their first Splatterhouse game. So it might be like a bit down the line if you're getting into the Splatterhouse mood to try out the 360 version, but don't make it your first go.
I feel like the all of the Splatterhouse 1, 2, and 3, they all hold up when it comes to gameplay. And it really depends on if you're like a completionist like me and want to play 1, 2, and 3 in order, or if you just want to play a fun beat 'em up game, then maybe just play 3. I feel like, especially with games of this era, the linearity, generally the sequels that came out tended to be better because they just had better technology. Though Splatterhouse, I think my favorite part about Splatterhouse is its name.
It's a good name. It tells you everything about the game, right?
Yeah.
Like if I was hanging out with some people and I was like, I want to play a game called Splatterhouse, you probably don't need to like guess what that game looks like.
Yeah, like you probably already in your head, when somebody says Splatterhouse, without ever seeing any artwork for the game, are already picturing who the main character is.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like in your head, you're probably like, he looks like this, and it's probably not far from the truth.
And with that's our Splatterhouse episode. We are now getting to our retro rewind. And Seth, I think it makes most sense for you to come first because you covered a little topic that was very close to this episode.
Right, so Zach had me playing Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, which was originally released, as we discussed, in 1989, but only in Japan. It was developed by Now Productions, published by Namco, and it is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that involves some jumping, and it was developed for the Famicom, which makes it kind of the only Splatterhouse game published on like a vague Nintendo thing.
Yeah, I think it is the only Splatterhouse game that is on a Nintendo console, but not and not like a port of it or something. Right, so like the TurboGrafx version of Splatterhouse was on the Wii Virtual Console, but
right,
like
but that doesn't
count to me. Yeah.
So Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti was the only Splatterhouse game that was developed for a Nintendo console. It is a parody, 100% of Splatterhouse, where all of the characters are chibi, which I have learned is also for super deformed.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
If you're not familiar with chibi or super deformed style of artistry, they are essentially drawn like caricatures where their features are exaggerated. They tend to be short, they tend to be round, and they tend to have stubby appendages while having giant heads. You play as, I was going to say Jason, but it's obviously not Jason. You play as Rick in the game. It starts off, you're in a graveyard, and you're hanging out with your lady, and the mask comes, and then you become Rick, and I think the lady gets taken away. And then you have to traverse across this graveyard punching creatures. It's for the Famicom, so there is a directional button and a button and a B button. One of the buttons punches and the other button jumps, and it has platforming elements. Those platforming elements are you jumping over holes. It's actually pretty fun. I had 2 moments where I actually laughed, not out loud. Me laughing is unusual for games because I generally don't laugh at games that are trying to be deliberately funny, which Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti is definitely trying to be funny. The first boss of the game is a vampire, and they actually dance to Thriller in a wonderful 8-bit little jingle. And they dance with 4 different creatures of the Black Lagoon, or at least creatures that look like the creature of the Black Lagoon. So like a green little fish creature. And then once the song is done, the vampire pelts you with 3 different balls that look like pumpkins very quickly that you have to avoid, all while the multiple creatures of the Black Lagoon spawn and attack you in crazy numbers. The one thing that I have to comment is this boss fight is dramatically more difficult than the rest of the level. Like, the rest of the level is, I would say, borderline easy. You have to jump and hit things, and they're generally pretty slow and you can get to them. The boss is very difficult. I had a difficult time beating the boss. I'm also bad at games. so that may be why. Now, one of the cool factors that I liked is that there's no time, and if you killed 10 creatures, you got some of your life back, and when you're playing against the boss, that 10 kills goes up to 20 kills. Fun game, definitely worth the playthrough if you enjoy Splatterhouse, or if you want to play a fun little NES style beat 'em up game. Definitely check it out. It is a little tough, but most Nintendo NES games are. And for next week, Zach, I want you to play Claw from 1997 for the PC.
All right, sounds good. Well, Seth had me play a game that I've definitely talked about on this podcast because we had a whole episode dedicated to this game, and that is Doom from 1993. Doom was created by id Software, of course, and we've talked about it a lot before, so I don't know what else I can say. It's one of those games I can literally always go back and play, so I'm really happy Seth let me play this really fun game. Talking about Doom, though, from a perspective of someone who loves Doom. I think the thing that I love most about Doom is literally just the first level. E1M1 is what it's called. It just starts off so heavy in terms of the music. Like, the music is right in your face. It just puts you immediately into a mood to do exactly what you're going to do, and that's kill a bunch of demons with a wide variety of weapons. Personally, I think vanilla Doom, like OG, original Doom, and Doom 2 are far superior to any mod of Doom, excluding Chex Quest. What I mean, though, is that there are tons of mods that add more violence, update the weapons, update the graphics. I've seen mods that do lighting effects. No. All of that is awful. I want OG Doom. No special effects, no extra blood. Original Doom. Nothing beats the original. So does Doom hold up? Absolutely, of course it does. And why wouldn't it? It's available on every single thing possible. When Seth was like, you should play Doom, I honestly thought to myself, which version of Doom should I play? Because there's so many versions of Doom out there. I ended up playing just one of the original versions through a source port called PR Boom, which is one of the more accurate source ports out there to the original experience. But next week, Seth, I want you to take a walk down id Lane, and I want you to play Wolfenstein 3D.
Oh, excellent. I will enjoy this.
And with that, that's it for our episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Happy Halloween to everyone out there. Stay spooky and stay safe. In a few weeks, on the 11th, Seth and I will be going live for Extra Life for 24 hours from November 11th to November 12th, and we will be playing a wide variety of games. Maybe we'll play Doom. Maybe we'll play Wanpaku Graffiti. Who knows? We're still coming up with our schedule. But keep an eye out on all of our social media channels. And by doing that, you can visit Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, or Twitter. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitch are Classic Gaming Brothers. Twitter is CG Brothers Pod. Be sure to also go to our website. You can listen to our podcast there. And let your friends know that they can listen to us anywhere that podcasts are available. And with that, that's it. Do you have anything to add?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I have been Zach.
We've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's
right.
Right.